April 23rd, 1945, 14:30 hours. Outskirts of Berlin. Klaus Schneider presses himself into the rubble of what was once a bakery. 14 years old, uniform too large, Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon nearly as tall as he is. His hands shake, not from fear of the Soviet tanks grinding toward him through the smoke, but from what the Hauptsturmführer said 3 hours ago. Your mother, your sister, they're in Charlottenburg. Remember that, boy. The threat required no elaboration. Klaus knows what happens to families of deserters. He's seen the bodies hanging from lampposts, the cardboard signs around their necks. Ich war zu. Feige. I was too cowardly to defend my homeland. He is a soldier. He is a child. These facts coexist in the dying gasps of the Third Reich. The harvest. They came for boys like Klaus in the autumn of 1944, though the machinery of desperation had been grinding for months before. The Wehrmacht was bleeding out on two fronts. Every offensive consumed divisions. Every retreat left thousands dead or captured. By September, Germany faced a mathematics of annihilation, losses outpacing replacements by catastrophic margins. The solution arrived with bureaucratic efficiency. Volkssturm, the people's storm, a militia of the too young and too old, conscripted by decree, armed with whatever remained in depleted arsenals. On October 18, 1944, all German males between 16 and 60 became soldiers by law. But 16 was merely the official threshold. In practice, by early 1945, recruitment officers ignored birth dates with studied indifference. 14. 13. In some documented cases, 12-year-old boys received uniforms and weapons. The Hitler Youth had prepared them, in theory. Years of weekend camps, marching practice, ideological instruction. Now ideology translated into combat orders. Boys who'd thrown wooden grenades at papier-mâché tanks found themselves facing actual Soviet T-34s with actual Panzerfausts. Training lasted between 2 hours and 2 weeks, depending on how desperately the front needed bodies. Klaus Schneider received 4 days. Others received less. The architecture of coercion. The system operated through layered intimidation, each level reinforcing compliance through familial hostage-taking. Nazi officials understood that 14-year-olds might break under fire, might flee, might refuse orders. Traditional military discipline, harsh as it was, proved insufficient for children conscripted against their will and thrown into losing battles. So, they innovated. Unit commanders received explicit instructions. Make it clear that desertion meant death for families, not arrest, not imprisonment, death. SS officers and Gestapo functionaries visited homes, informing mothers and fathers that their sons' military service protected the entire household. The implication crystallized into explicit threat. In some units, officers maintained lists, names and addresses visible in command posts. A reminder, your family's location is known. Your family's safety depends on your obedience. Heinz Müller, 13 when conscripted in February 1945, later recalled the instruction with crystalline clarity. The officer gathered us in a circle. He said our mothers and sisters depended on our bravery. He said cowards brought shame that couldn't be washed away, shame that fell on everyone who shared their blood. Then he said the SS was watching our families. He didn't need to explain further. This wasn't metaphorical. The SS maintained extensive networks in German cities, even as those cities crumbled under Allied bombing. They had personnel for executions. They had personnel for surveillance. They had personnel for making examples. The lampposts told the story. Throughout 1945, bodies swung in public squares, deserters, resistors, anyone accused of defeatism. Many were soldiers who'd fled their units. Some were teenagers. The signs varied in wording, but shared identical message. This is what happens when you fail the Reich. Children saw these bodies walking to school, Mothers saw them fetching water. The lesson required no elaboration. The deployment. By March 1945, child soldiers served throughout Germany's collapsing defensive perimeter. They manned anti-aircraft batteries in Berlin. They defended bridges in the Ruhr. They held positions in East Prussia as the Red Army rolled forward. The youngest units deployed to defensive positions, trenches, fortified buildings, roadblocks. Commanders knew these boys couldn't execute complex maneuvers or sustain offensive operations. They could, however, occupy space, fire weapons, die, holding ground until adult units repositioned. The Panzerfaust became their signature weapon, a single-shot anti-tank rocket launcher requiring minimal training. Point at tank, remove, safety, pull, trigger. The explosion would either destroy the target or reveal your position for elimination. Either way, the tactical doctrine was expenditure. In Berlin's final weeks, an estimated 10,000 Hitler Youth members participated in the city's defense. Exact numbers remain contested because record-keeping collapsed alongside the regime. But Soviet after-action reports describe encountering child soldiers repeatedly, sometimes in formed units, sometimes in ad hoc groups commanded by fanatical officers. These children fought with varying degrees of commitment. Some believed the propaganda, genuinely convinced they defended civilization against Bolshevik hordes. Others simply survived hour to hour, trapped between Soviet advance and SS execution squads behind their own lines. The Feldgendarmerie, military police, patrolled rear areas specifically hunting deserters. They operated mobile courts-martial, delivering verdicts within hours, executions within minutes. Age provided no protection. The Reich was collapsing. Traditional sentimentality about childhood had been abandoned alongside every other civilizing restraint. Klaus Schneider, pressed into bakery rubble, understood this calculus perfectly. Advance toward the Soviet tanks and probably die. Retreat toward German lines and certainly die, and possibly take his family with him. The encounters. Allied forces confronted this phenomenon with varying reactions. American and British troops, pushing through Western Germany, initially expressed disbelief upon capturing child prisoners. Intelligence reports from April 1945 document multiple instances of soldiers finding boys aged 12 to 15 in Wehrmacht uniforms, sometimes crying, sometimes defiant, always exhausted. Lieutenant Robert Jameson, U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, described one encounter in a letter home. "We cleared a building in Bavaria and found 4 boys hiding in the cellar. The oldest might have been 15. They had rifles and grenades, but they dropped them immediately when we came down. One was wounded, gut shot, clearly dying. He kept apologizing in broken English, not for fighting us, but for failing his mother. It took us an hour to understand what he meant." What he meant was the threat, the system of hostage families, the machinery that transformed children into soldiers through coercion, rather than conviction. Soviet forces, having suffered the full brutality of Wehrmacht invasion and occupation, demonstrated less sympathy. After years of total war, Red Army soldiers viewed German defenders with grim pragmatism regardless of age. If they fought, they died. Memoirs from Soviet veterans occasionally mention child soldiers, usually in passing, as one more grotesque element of Nazi Germany's final descent. The reckoning. The killing stopped before the dying did. May 8, 1945. Unconditional surrender. The Reich ceased to exist. But thousands of child soldiers remained scattered across ruined Germany, some imprisoned by Allied forces, others simply abandoned by collapsed command structures, still others dead in unmarked graves across the Eastern Front. Klaus Schneider survived. He would rarely speak of those final weeks, even decades later. The details emerged in fragments: the bakery rubble, the approaching tanks, the Hauptsturmführer's threat, the decision to surrender to Soviet troops rather than retreat to German lines, the months in a POW camp, the eventual return to Berlin to discover his mother and sister had survived the city's fall. He was one of the fortunate ones. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 40,000 child soldiers served in Germany's final months. Exact figures lost in the chaos of collapse. Thousands died in combat. Thousands more died from wounds, starvation, or in the brutal aftermath when scores were settled. Some survived physically, but carried psychological fractures that never healed. The Nuremberg trials addressed many Nazi crimes. The conscription of children received remarkably little attention. International law would later codify prohibitions against child soldiers. The optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted in 2000, sets 18 as the minimum age for military recruitment. But in 1945 and 1946, prosecutors focused on more visible atrocities: concentration camps, mass executions, aggressive war. The children of the Volkssturm became a footnote, a disturbing detail in the larger catalogue of Nazi horror. Few officers faced specific charges for their role in recruiting, threatening, and deploying 14-year-olds into combat. The weight. What remains is memory, incomplete and contested. These were not child soldiers in the modern sense, drugged, kidnapped, turned into weapons by warlords. They were conscripted by a dying state that had abandoned all restraint, coerced through threats against their families, and deployed in battles that served no strategic purpose beyond delaying inevitable defeat by hours or days. They were victims who carried weapons, children forced into positions where they killed and died for a regime that viewed them as expendable resources. The moral complexity resists simple categorization. They pulled triggers. They fired Panzerfausts at Allied tanks. They fought, and they were 14 years old, terrified, manipulated through the most fundamental human bond, love of family transformed into mechanism of control. The officers who issued the threats mostly escaped accountability. Some died in the war's final chaos. Others melted into post-war confusion, changed identities, disappeared. A few faced trial for other crimes, but rarely for the specific act of threatening children's families to ensure battlefield compliance. Klaus Schneider, interviewed in 1989, said simply, "I wasn't brave. I wasn't a hero. I was a boy who wanted his mother to live." They understood that. They used it. That's all there is to say. That's not quite all, because what happened in Germany's final months represents something we still struggle to name: the industrialization of childhood's exploitation, the bureaucratization of familial hostage-taking, the systematic transformation of love into weapon. The Third Reich innovated many horrors. This was among them. The boys who survived carried it forward. The ones who died left only absence. And the system that created them dissolved into history, leaving behind questions about how far states will descend when confronting collapse, about which bonds they'll exploit, about which innocence they'll consume in service of doomed causes. April 23rd, 1945, 14:30 hours. A 14-year-old boy in bakery rubble, weighing his life against his mother's, his fear against threats made real by bodies hanging from lampposts. He was a soldier. He was a child. Both true, both unforgivable.